Today, we are immersing ourselves in a story that is, frankly, difficult to comprehend. It's the case of Gisèle Pelicot, a case that absolutely gripped France and then the world back in 2024. And it's not just the horrific nature of the crime itself. It's the sheer systematic betrayal involved. We're talking about a marriage that looked, completely tranquil on the surface, but underneath, a decade of orchestrated abuse by a husband who invited dozens of men, more than 50 men, into their home to rape his wife while she was unconscious. So our mission today is to really take a forensic look. How did the systemic horror even start? How was it maintained for so long? What finally brought it all crashing down? And maybe most importantly, what is the monumental legacy, legal, cultural, left by Gisèle's incredible courage? Okay, let's try and unpack this staggering case.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital we approach this carefully. It's a devastating character study, yes, but it's also, I think, a critical look at where society fails regarding consent. Our sources really give us deep context here on the victims, obviously, but also on the twisted psychology of Dominique Pelicot, the husband, and the motivations or a lack thereof of the men he brought in. And then there's the powerful social movement that just exploded afterwards. The starting point seems almost simple, doesn't it? A retired couple, south of France, friends called them the perfect couple, but behind closed doors, it was a decade of sexual violence facilitated by drugs, by deceit. So this deep dive, we're going to show you how technology, domestic abuse, and really profound psychological trauma all intersected. It created a crime on a scale that's just, well, almost unparalleled.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The foundation, the Pelicot marriage itself. Gisèle and Dominique, both born in 1952. They meet young, 1971. Married just 2 years later, 73. And they build a family life, raise 3 children, David, Caroline, and Florian. For decades, it looks like they're just navigating the usual ups and downs of married life.
Well, usual might be stretching it a bit. Their relationship, it certainly had its volatility. But they always seemed to come back together, didn't they? We know Gisèle had an affair, lasted about 3 years, back in the mid-'80s. And Dominique, well, he moved out for several months in the 90s because he was having an affair too. But they patched things up. They even renewed their vows later in 2007. What the sources really highlight, though, is this growing power imbalance, mostly financial. And that seems to have become a really deep resentment for Dominique.
Tell us more about their economic side, because it feels like it directly feeds into his later obsession with total control.
Yeah, absolutely. Gisèle was really the financial anchor for the family. She had a long, successful career in administration, worked for the state electricity company. Basically, she kept the family's standard of living afloat. Dominique, on the other hand, he struggled professionally pretty much his whole life. He tried being an electrician, an estate agent, set up several businesses. They all failed consistently. And this instability, it hit a crisis point in 2001. They actually got divorced temporarily.
Temporarily divorced.
Exactly. It wasn't a real split. It was purely a financial move, a cynical one, really, designed to protect their assets, the house, savings from the creditors Dominique owed money to because of his failed businesses. So you see this long history. Financial irresponsibility on his part, reliance on Gisèle, and we believe that fostered this deep-seated resentment in him, maybe an inferiority complex.
Right. Despite all that financial trouble, though, by the time they retire, around 2013, they've managed to create this picture of, perfect retirement bliss almost. They moved to Mazan, small town, southeastern France, renting a nice villa, big garden, swimming pool. They really look like the ideal settled retirees.
Absolutely. The facade was meticulously constructed. Dominique kept busy with things people would see as normal, respectable, cycling, the local tennis club. And Gisèle was active too, joined a choir, spent a lot of time looking after their grandkids. Neighbors consistently described them as very lovely people. They had absolutely no clue they were watching a performance, basically.
A carefully managed performance.
Precisely. And that perceived normality, that illusion, it just made the eventual discovery of the abuse even more shattering for everyone who knew them.
But that facade, as you said, it was built on Dominique's really troubled psychological history. Our sources dig into his background and it paints a very, very dark picture.
Yeah, it's grim. He grew up in what's described as a working-class, dysfunctional environment, marked by brutality. He talked about witnessing abuse towards his mother, and even more tragically, he reported being molested himself by a male nurse when he was just 9. And then as a teenager, he said he was forced to watch a gang rape. Psychiatrists later suggested that all this trauma, piled on top of his professional failures, his feelings of inferiority next to Gisèle, it created this profound pathology. He felt powerless, basically, and he sought total control in the one place he felt entitled to it, his marriage.
That history of trauma is horrifying. But, of course, it doesn't excuse what he did. How did the experts actually diagnose his adult issues? What specific perversions did the investigation uncover?
Well, after his arrest, the forensic psychological analysis was pretty severe. He got diagnosed with a whole range of things: antisocial personality disorder, that's the lack of empathy, disregard for others' rights, profound egomania, too. And crucially, the sources detail diagnoses of paraphilias. These are, abnormal sexual desires. Things like sadism, exhibitionism, and critically, somnophilia.
Somnophilia. Can you explain that one a bit better?
Sure. Somnophilia is a specific paraphilia. It involves getting sexual arousal from having sex with someone who's asleep or unconscious. For Dominique, this became the absolute core mechanism of his crimes. The psychiatrist concluded it was intrinsically linked to this desire he had for complete domination over Gisèle. The wife, he paradoxically kept saying he loved immensely. The act of penetrating her while she was inert, completely unable to react or refuse. That was his ultimate perverse satisfaction, a really twisted way to assert control, dominance, in a life where he felt like a failure.
The idea of his split personality, the normal guy by day, this monster by night, it's terrifying. Were there any signs, anything Gisèle or the family might have missed leading up to the really systematic abuse?
Oh yeah, there were definite red flags, clear ones. Back in 2010, this is before Maison, they were living near Paris. Dominique got caught upskirting women in a supermarket.
Upskirting. 10 years before the main arrest.
Yes. He paid a small fine, about €100, just to avoid prosecution. And Gisèle never found out about it, completely unaware. So that behavior, it was an early sign. Voyeurism, control issues. And sources say this really escalated as he got closer to retirement. He apparently grew more sexually frustrated because Gisèle, quite understandably, refused certain things he wanted, like swinging or other practices. That frustration, maybe compounded by his old resentment over her affair back in the 80s, though he denied it, was just revenge. It pushed him towards searching online for material, and that laid the groundwork for the organized abuse that came next.
So we have this picture now, a deeply troubled, resentful man hiding it all behind this mask of a nice retirement. But the mask started slipping. Not with violence, initially, but with something much more sinister, calculated chemical control.
Yeah, the systematic abuse. It almost started by chance, in a way. But Dominique seized that chance with just chilling efficiency. Gisèle was prescribed Temesta, that's the brand name for lorazepam. It's an anxiolytic, a drug for anxiety. He noticed it made her drowsy. And that simple observation, that became the gateway to a decade of drugging her into submission.
It wasn't just a fleeting thought, though, was it?
Yeah.
It quickly became this sustained chemical assault. He needed to make sure she was reliably unconscious, consistently, for the men he planned to bring in later.
Exactly. Temesta, lorazepam, it's a benzodiazepine, benzos. They're known for sedation, obviously, but critically, they have powerful amnestic effects. They stop new memories forming. And that's exactly what Dominique exploited. He didn't just rely on her prescription, he started systematically crushing pills, hers, or other sleeping pills he got from his own doctor, and secretly adding them to her food, her drinks. The scale is just. It shows incredible premeditation. Investigators found out he was prescribed and then used something like 450 pills in just 1 year.
450 pills in 1 year. That's more than one a day. And the sources mention this incredibly sinister detail, an adjustment he made, that just underlines how cold and calculating he was.
Yeah, that detail is truly chilling. It shows his operational mindset. He actually had to switch the brand of tranquilizers he was using at one point. Why? Because the first one was, quote, too salty.
Too salty.
Yeah. The taste was noticeable. He was afraid Gisèle might detect it, that it would jeopardize the whole operation. His absolute priority was concealment. Total concealment of the crime, required extreme precision in how he delivered the drugs.
And the physical toll on Gisèle. Over these 9 years of constant secret drugging, what was happening to her?
The effects were just disastrous for her health and deeply misunderstood at the time, of course. She suffered memory lapses, became really worried about her mind, her cognitive function. Sometimes her speech was incoherent. She even experienced hair loss or recurrent gynecological problems. Tragically, she genuinely started to worry she had Alzheimer's. Or maybe a brain tumor. She went for tests, but they always came back negative. And whenever she saw doctors, Dominique was always there, playing the part. The devoted, worried husband, blaming all her symptoms on stress or exhaustion from looking after the grandkids.
So he was gaslighting her. Physically, medically, emotionally.
Just completely.
What was her actual physical state during the assaults themselves?
Experts who reviewed the evidence, the videos, they described her state as being closer to a coma than sleep. She was entirely inert, completely unresponsive. The videos apparently show her sometimes curled up, like in a fetal position. Investigators noted times where she seemed to choke when the men forced themselves on her. It's horrifying. The only time Gisèle felt any relief, felt better, was when she was away from Maison, visiting family. But she never made the connection. She thought her symptoms were internal, neurological, all thanks to Dominique's incredibly careful deception.
So once he'd perfected the drugging, the chemical submission, he escalated to mass assault. He started filming the acts, initially just for himself apparently, but then he used the internet, the anonymity, to recruit others. What was that online operation like?
His ultimate goal seems to have been this shared degradation, shared control. He started sharing videos, soliciting men on an online forum. It was called a soninsu.
A soninsu. That means without her knowledge.
Exactly. And he communicated directly through Skype, too. That name, Ah Sun-soo, it became his core lie, his cover story. He spun this completely false narrative, claimed that he and Gisèle shared this niche consensual fetish, sex while she was asleep. That was the critical deception, the lie that many of the co-defendants later clung to, saying they believed it. It let them rationalize taking part.
Let's just nail down the scale here again. How many men are we talking about? Over what time frame?
The abuse went on for a terrifying 9 years, from 2011 right up to 2020. He filmed and photographed 92 separate rapes, committed by at least 72 different men. Though in the end, the investigation could only identify 50 of them for the trial. And crucially, these men were recruited for free. There was no money involved, which just makes it even more depraved, doesn't it? It wasn't transactional. It was purely about this shared perverse experience, control, and degrading her. Dominique was the orchestrator, directing it all from the sidelines.
The level of detail he went into to hide it all, and it's just chilling. Tell us about the protocol he set up for the men coming to the house.
These rules, they're like forensic proof of his premeditation, his intent to deceive. They were meticulously calculated, all designed to stop Gisèle waking up or noticing anything suspicious afterwards. The men got extremely strict instructions. They had to park their cars streets away, avoid suspicion. When they came in, they had to strip completely naked in the kitchen before going to the bedroom. They were ordered no fragrance, no cologne, and definitely no cigarette smoke smell. But maybe the most horrifying clinical instruction. They had to clip and wash their fingernails right before the assault.
Why the fingernails? What was the logic there?
Because even a tiny scratch, an abrasion on her skin, which can easily happen during a non-consensual act, could leave a mark. Something Gisèle might feel or see when she woke up. It could raise suspicion. His concern wasn't minimizing her trauma. It was purely about protecting his operation, keeping it going. Dominique was apparently present for every single rape, filming it all, making obscene comments. Sometimes he'd tell the men to avoid brusque gestures, not out of care for his wife, but because he claimed he hated brutality in his perverse fantasy world.
And this meticulousness, it extended to how he documented everything. He kept this undeniable archive, which, ironically, became the ultimate evidence against him.
Absolutely. He filed everything. Over 20,000 images, 300 videos on a hard drive. In a folder he labeled, with chillingly cold efficiency, just abuses. He organized them, too. Explicit, detailed titles. Cross-referenced them with the names of the men involved. This wasn't just documentation, it was like his trophy cabinet. A detailed logbook of his power, his control. That folder, that was the key that blew the whole thing wide open.
And the sources reveal something even darker, if that's possible. That this sickness, this pattern, it was contagious. It spread beyond his own home through a man described as his disciple.
Yeah, this is the side story of Jean-Pierre Maréchal. A man Dominique somehow convinced to replicate the exact same pattern of abuse, drugging and raping his own wife. Maréchal became Dominique's clone, as the sources put it. Dominique actually visited Maréchal's home over in Drôme about a dozen times between 2015 and 2020. He actively participated in the rapes of Mrs. Maréchal. He even gave Maréchal extra sedatives for future visits when he couldn't be there.
And what happened in that case? Did Maréchal's wife, did she press charges?
Tragically, no. She didn't file a complaint. Reportedly, she made the incredibly difficult decision to stay silent to protect their children, which just highlights the immense fear, the pressure surrounding these kinds of domestic crimes, and the complexities there are huge. Maréchal later claimed his own issues stemmed from witnessing generational abuse, said he saw his own father invite strangers to rape his drunk mother when he was a child. So the Pelicot case, it didn't just expose one man's horror. It shone a light on this insidious, replicating pattern of force hidden within society.
The way this was set up, so systematic, it feels like without some kind of external shock, some catastrophic event, this horror could have just gone on indefinitely. That trigger finally came in September 2020, and it was rooted in the same behavior that had marked Dominique for years: voyeurism. He got arrested again for upserting 3 women in a supermarket in Carpentras.
It's incredible, isn't it? The exact same offense he committed 10 years earlier. But this time, crucially, the system intervened differently. That upskirting arrest was the spark. But the investigation nearly stopped right there. It was actually the intuition of a psychiatrist, a Dr. Laurent Liette. He interviewed Dominique after the arrest, noticed something off, a disturbing dissonance in his behavior, a disconnect between how calm he seemed and the offense itself. And Liette urged the police, investigate further. Don't just stop at the upskirting charge.
That psychiatric advice turned out to be absolutely critical. What was the piece of evidence that finally led the police from upskirting to the abuses folder?
Right, so Dominique was released on bail initially, but one very sharp police officer decided to dig deeper into Dominique's confiscated digital stuff. Didn't just look at the obvious photo files. Focused on his Skype account. And there it was. Specific incriminating messages, alluding to drugging his wife with anxiolytics. That was the proof they needed. They got a search warrant. On November 2nd, 2020, investigators searched the house again, and they found it. The abuses folder. Over 20,000 images, 300 videos, showing his unconscious wife being raped. Dominique was rearrested that same day, and faced with his own meticulous archive, he immediately admitted everything.
That moment, November 2nd, that must have been utterly devastating. How did Gisèle actually find out? What was her initial reaction when confronted with this betrayal?
The scene described in the sources. It's almost impossible to imagine. Gisèle was called to the police station that day, November 2nd, and they showed her the images. Images of herself, inert, unconscious, sometimes curled up, vulnerable, in a fetal position, being assaulted by her husband, by strangers, over nearly 10 years. Before she saw that evidence, she'd actually defended Dominique to the investigators, called him a super guy, believed their marriage, despite its problems, was fundamentally strong.
She'd spent almost a decade thinking she had some kind of neurological disease, when the reality was this systematic campaign of drugging and abuse by the person she trusted most.
The collapse was total, immediate. Her words when she saw the images were just heart-wrenching. My world is collapsing. For me, everything is falling apart, everything I had built in 50 years. The trust was absolute, and the realization that he had orchestrated all of it lied constantly. She told the police she felt like she was nothing but a thing to him. And it's crucial to remember this. Even after Dominique's first arrest for upskirting in September, he didn't stop. He kept inviting men over for 2 more months. The very last recorded abuse happened on October 22nd, 2020, just days before the police found that hard drive. The betrayal was just relentless, right up to the very last moment.
And the trauma didn't stop with Gisèle, did it? The investigation uncovered that Dominique's abuse had tendrils reaching into the rest of the family, too.
Indeed. It was sickeningly pervasive. Investigators found images taken with hidden cameras of his 2 daughters-in-law in the shower. And perhaps most painfully, they found images of his own daughter, Caroline, semi-naked, unconscious on a bed. This led Caroline to state publicly that she strongly suspected she had also been abused by her father at some point. The entire family unit was just shattered. Utterly. Gisèle's son David testified during the trial about the impact on his own child, said his son needed therapy. Florian, the other son, spoke about how the stress contributed to his divorce. And Caroline Darien, who later wrote that powerful memoir, And I Stopped Calling You Dad, she described feeling like the forgotten victim in the whole media storm. Her specific trauma kind of overshadowed by the sheer scale of what happened to her mother.
Preparing for the trial must have been a massive undertaking, just identifying all the co-defendants from those images and videos.
It was an unprecedented investigation, really. Police spent 2 full years meticulously identifying the men involved. They ultimately brought 50 of the 72 known men to trial, though some reports suggest the total number of perpetrators might have been even higher, maybe closer to 83. And these accused men, they weren't some shadowy figures from the fringes. They were a chilling cross-section of French society, aged from 25 up to 74. The list included a soldier, a nurse, a journalist, a firefighter, a truck driver, a self-employed plumber, just ordinary jobs. Worryingly, 23 of the accused already had previous convictions, some for domestic or sexual violence, suggesting, a pre-existing disrespect for women's autonomy.
And while Dominique was locked up, waiting for trial for the crimes against Gisèle, his past kept surfacing, revealing some serious failures by law enforcement along the way.
Yes, this is a critical point that needs underlining. While he was on remand, his DNA finally got linked to an attempted rape from way back in 1999. The victim was a young estate agent named Estella B. He eventually admitted to that crime, too. But here's the failure, that DNA match. It had actually been flagged during his 2010 upskirting arrest, 10 years earlier. But the police back then failed to follow up on it, a whole decade lost. The justice minister actually launched an investigation later to figure out how that major police oversight happened, and there was more. He was also suspected in a 1991 rape and murder case, another estate agent. But the DNA sample from that crime scene had been lost over the years, so they couldn't prosecute him for it when he was arrested in 2010 or even later. So the trial wasn't just about the decade of abuse against Gisèle. It became about decades of his unchecked predatory behavior, enabled at least partly by these systemic failures.
So as the trial gets closer, Gisèle Pelicot makes a decision, a truly remarkable choice that elevates her. She goes from being a victim in this horrific crime story to becoming a global feminist icon. She insists on waiving her right to anonymity. She wants a public trial, starting in September 2024.
That decision was absolutely monumental, especially in France, where protecting victim anonymity in sexual assault cases is often the standard practice, to shield them from public scrutiny. Her own lawyers, even the prosecutors, advised against it. They were worried about her dignity, the emotional toll. But Gisèle refused. She was adamant. And her reasoning became this powerful rallying cry. Shame must change sides.
What drove her to take that on, that immense emotional burden of a public trial?
She said her motivation was simple but profound. Determination to change society. She felt she was in a unique position because of the evidence, the meticulous video evidence her husband had created, evidence most victims of sexual assault never have. She wasn't looking for personal comfort, she said. She wanted accountability. Cultural change, she argued quite powerfully. It's not bravery, it's will and determination. She even challenged the presiding judge. He initially wanted to exclude the public when they showed the videos of the assaults in court. She fought that successfully, argued that society needed to witness the reality of what happened to truly grasp the crime.
In the trial itself, it effectively became a test case for French consent law, didn't it? The legal backdrop here is really important for people listening outside France.
Absolutely vital. Up until this case, the French Penal Code defined rape based on proving violence, constraint, threat, or surprise. It was focused on what the aggressor did, rather than the victim's consent or lack thereof. Critically, it didn't explicitly include a clear reference to the necessity of consent, which meant defense lawyers in cases like this could argue, well, if there wasn't an obvious struggle, no overt violence, maybe the victim was just surprised. Maybe the legal definition didn't quite fit. Gisèle's case, being entirely about chemical submission, about non-consent while unconscious, it provided this undeniable, unavoidable pressure point. It drove the need for explicit legal reform towards what many call a yes means yes standard.
The courtroom dynamics must have been incredibly intense, starting with Dominique's own testimony, which sounds quite contradictory.
Oh, it was. Dominique was, well, predictably self-pitying in many ways. He confessed. He stood up and said, "I am a rapist, like the others in this room." He begged for forgiveness from his children, from Gisèle. Yet, in the same breath, he insisted he still loved Gisèle immensely. Clinging to this narrative of the devoted husband, despite orchestrating a decade of horror, he leaned heavily on his traumatic childhood, trying to argue for this split personality that drove his actions. But crucially, he refused to take the fall for the other 50 men. He insisted they knew exactly what they were doing, that they weren't misled about the fact she couldn't consent.
Okay, what about the 50 co-defendants? Their arguments must have been all over the place, but essentially, they were all trying to rationalize raping an unconscious woman.
They absolutely were. And their defenses really expose the pervasive nature of rape culture. You could basically group their excuses into 3 main categories. First, there was the misled-deceived argument. Many claimed Dominique totally fooled them, that they genuinely believed they were part of some consensual couple sexual fantasy. They argued Dominique had this convincing story that made them feel okay about it. That was their main defense against the rape charge. Second, the husband's consent argument. Others, like one man, Jean-Luc Blas, who admitted to 2 rapes, actually argued they thought the husband's permission was enough, legally sufficient. He literally said if Dominique consented for Gisèle, it wasn't against the law. This just laid bare this deep-seated patriarchal idea that a husband somehow owns his wife's body. And third, diminished responsibility. Another group tried to argue they were somehow lobotomized or completely under Dominique's charismatic spell, claimed they were just ordinary men caught up in something they didn't fully grasp. Of course, the prosecution and Gisèle's legal team countered all of this forcefully. They hammered home the fundamental legal principle. An unconscious person cannot consent. Period. Regardless of what the husband might have said.
And Gisèle herself wasn't just a witness, was she? She was a party civil in the trial. Can you quickly explain what that means in the French system? It's different from what many listeners might be used to.
Right. The term parties civils is really important here. In the French legal system, victims aren't just passive witnesses who give testimony and then leave. They can formally register as civil parties. This means they hire their own lawyers, they actively participate in the prosecution alongside the state prosecutor. They can seek damages, formal recognition of the harm done. It's quite distinct from many common law systems like in the US or UK. Being a party civil gave Gisèle a really powerful, formal voice in the courtroom. Her lawyers could cross-examine witnesses, present arguments, challenge the defense directly.
And that formal role was definitely needed, especially when she faced hostile questioning from the defense lawyers representing the 50 other men.
Oh, absolutely. The defense strategies often sunk into classic victim blaming. It's a tactic, right? Trying to create doubt about whether she truly didn't consent. Defense lawyers tried suggesting she was an exhibitionist, or maybe even complicit. They pointed to a tiny fraction of the 20,000 images where she might have appeared momentarily awake, or just inert but not visibly fighting back. Gisèle had to confront these vicious insinuations directly. She testified emphatically, repeatedly, that she was simply inert because of the powerful drugs he gave her.
And her response to that line of attack became a real defining moment of the trial, didn't it?
It was incredibly powerful. She basically turned it back on them. She retorted that this kind of hostile questioning, this relentless scrutiny of the victim's behavior, her character, that's exactly why so many victims of sexual assault never come forward, never press charges. She went on to condemn the cowardice of the men in the dock, and she demanded the court look beyond them to examine the role of a macho patriarchal society that trivialized rape. She shifted the focus right back onto the perpetrators and the culture that enabled them.
The family testimony during this part of the trial sounds just agonizing. We touched on the pain of her children earlier.
Yeah, the children, also acting as party civils, spoke with such raw emotion. Caroline Darien, who wrote the memoir, talked about feeling like the forgotten victim, overshadowed by the focus on her mother. The sons, David and Florian, spoke about the utter destruction of their families. Dave mentioned his own child needing therapy just to cope with the reality of who their grandfather was. Florian talked about his divorce, the stress contributing. The trial was essentially this drawn-out public dissection of their entire family history. Gut-wrenching.
And one of the most defining, defiant moments for Gisèle herself, the one that really cemented her status as the symbol of strength, came when a defense lawyer questioned why she kept her married name, Pelicot, even after the divorce.
Her answer was just iconic. Absolutely iconic. She declared right there in court that she wanted her grandchildren to be proud of the name Pelicot, a name that, because of her actions, her courage, would now be known around the world, associated not with her husband's monstrosity, but with her fight, her determination for justice. As her lawyer put it perfectly, Gisèle took something designed to utterly destroy her, and she turned it into this source of powerful public strength. She made it impossible for society to look away anymore.
So finally, December 19th, 2024, the verdicts come down. Dominique Pelicot was held accountable for the decade of horror he orchestrated.
Yes, he was convicted on all counts. Aggravated rape, taking those indecent images of his daughters-in-law, his daughter, everything. He received the maximum sentence possible under French law at the time, 20 years in prison. And significantly, the court added a stipulation: no possibility of parole before he serves at least 2/3 of that sentence. Dominique, maybe in one last cynical attempt at control or perhaps a genuine flicker of remorse, chose not to appeal his conviction. He stated he didn't want to put Gisèle through another ordeal.
And the 50 co-defendants, the men who tried every excuse in the book being misled, husband's permission, were they held accountable too?
They were, comprehensively. The panel of 5 judges completely rejected their defenses. All 50 men were convicted of aggravated rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault, depending on the specifics of their involvement. The sentences varied, ranging from 3 years up to 15 years. Jean-Pierre Marchal, remember him? The disciple who abused his own wife, he got 12 years. The judges sent a very clear, very forceful message with those convictions. The argument that a husband's consent can somehow override a victim's lack of consent, especially when she's unconscious, is completely invalid, null and void. Gisèle's own words after the verdict really reflected her enduring mission. She expressed hope for a future of harmony, in respect, and mutual understanding.
Now, while the main trial wrapped up in December 2024, the whole accountability process wasn't quite finished, was it? There were appeals. 17 of the men initially appealed, though most quickly backed down, leaving just one solitary case that went forward. Gisèle Dogan.
That's right. Dogon, a 44-year-old construction worker, he was the only one determined enough, or maybe foolish enough, to push for a second trial. It took place in Nîmes in October 2025. He stuck to his story. He wasn't a rapist, he claimed. He insisted Dominique had trapped him, made him believe it was all a consensual sexual game. He even argued he only realized something might be wrong when he claimed he heard Gisèle snoring. Dominique actually appeared as a witness in that appeal trial. And crucially, he refuted Dogon's claims, denied misleading him, denied ever calling it a sexual game.
And the outcome of that appeal really hinged on a tiny detail, didn't it? Something captured in Dominique's horrifying video archive, the specific footage of Dogon's assault.
Yes, this detail is perhaps one of the most damning pieces of evidence regarding intent for any of the men. An investigator, Jeremy Bosplatier, his testimony during the appeal was absolutely crucial. He used the video evidence to show the court that Dogon was, quote, fully aware Gisèle hadn't consented, and that she was actually distressed. The commissioner described footage where Gisèle moves slightly, just a natural reflexive movement, maybe from discomfort. And what does Dogon do? He immediately withdraws, freezes. In a waiting position, the investigator said, clearly worried she might wake up. Then, after about 30 seconds, seeing she hadn't woken up, that it was just a reflex. Dogon resumes the assault.
That 30-second pause, it's undeniable proof, isn't it? Proof he knew she wasn't consenting, that his actions depended entirely on her remaining inert.
Exactly. It demonstrated knowledge, intent, agency. He was actively monitoring her state, making sure she stayed unconscious before he continued. As one of Gisèle's lawyers argued so powerfully during that appeal, you don't touch a sleeping victim. It's that simple. Dogon's appeal was rejected, soundly. The appeals court actually increased his original sentence from 9 years to 10 years and mandated 5 years of psychological treatment afterwards. It sent a final, potent message. His claim of being tricked held no water, especially when his own actions on video contradicted it.
Beyond the courtroom verdicts and sentences, the wider impact of this case on society has just been monumental. Gisèle Pelicot truly transcended being just a victim. She became this genuine global feminist figure.
The recognition she received was immense, both official and cultural. She was named a Knight of the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian award. She was featured on the BBC's 100 Women list for the year, cited by the Financial Times as one of the world's most influential women. Her bravery just sparked these massive protests, politically, culturally, across France. You mentioned the numbers earlier, 35,000 people demonstrating just in Paris in November 2024. And crucially, her case brought long overdue attention to the issue of abuse against older victims, a group often completely overlooked in mainstream conversations about sexual violence.
And perhaps most fundamentally, this case provided that final, undeniable push for real, tangible legal change. Change that will redefine sexual assault law in France.
It absolutely did. It provided the unavoidable justification for reform. The case directly led French lawmakers to fast-track a bill explicitly updating the definition of rape in the Penal Code. The new law will finally move away from that inadequate standard of needing proof of violence, constraint, threat, or surprise. Instead, it will incorporate a clear, explicit reference to the necessity of consent, essentially codifying yes means yes. That bill is expected to pass, ensuring future courts define sexual assault primarily based on the lack of consent. It closes the loophole perpetrators tried to exploit regarding chemical submission or unconsciousness. That legal shift, that is perhaps Gisèle's most powerful, most lasting legacy. And it brings us back to something the prosecutor, Dominique C., said during that final Dogon appeal. Society needs an evolution, he argued, from rape culture to a culture of consent. That's what's needed for us to truly heal from the issues this case ripped open. Hashtag #outrampo.
So this deep dive into the Gisèle Pelicot case, it revealed a story of betrayal on just a staggering scale, maintained for a decade, through chemical submission, through constant deception. But ultimately, I think it's a narrative defined by Gisèle's extraordinary resilience, her agency, her conscious choice to waive anonymity, to stand up not just against her husband, but against 50 other men in that courtroom. It forced society to confront something deeply uncomfortable, to start shifting the shame away from the victim and squarely onto the perpetrators, and to have a real conversation about consent.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. Think about the sheer, terrifying ordinariness of those 51 convicted men. Firefighters, nurses, journalists, truck drivers. It led a lawyer for a French feminist group to conclude that a rapist is not a monster, but the product of a sick society. So, if we connect that to the bigger picture, what does it truly mean for our understanding of consent, for rape culture, when so many people from all walks of life could somehow rationalize raping an unconscious woman, simply because, as they claimed, The husband had given me permission. You have the information now. What will you do with it?